Hello, everybody. We're going to give folks a few more minutes to join this webinar. Appreciate you coming to the biggest danger to healthcare facilities in 2016. Very important information coming from a number of events recently. But please hold for a few more minutes and we're going to allow some other folks to join. Great. Well, why don't we go ahead and get started? And again, we want to thank you for attending this informational webinar. We're going to speak specifically around one of the biggest areas of risk for covered entities, and that relates to their business associate agreements and the management and oversight of those. And specifically address an issue of a recent OCR settlement of close to $2 million related towards inaction in management of a business associate. My name is Tom Leahy. I'm with Agify. I'm the Senior Vice President of Sales and Business Development, and I will be conducting this session. And I welcome all of you to this particular meeting. So really, what's the focus of the agenda first? We're going to talk a little bit about what happened to North Memorial Hospital in Minnesota. They were one of the organizations that recently accepted and settled an agreement related towards inaction on their business associate. We'll look at the overview of changes in HIPAA-related requirements related to business management and business associate vendor management and oversight, and what can or could be done to avoid these types of fines with your organization. So in general, what happened? North Memorial agreed to pay a $1.55 million settlement due to a breach that happened with one of their business associates. Essentially, a significant amount of private healthcare data was exposed, and really when the investigation went into why this happened, two things came out in general. One, that they were fined because there was a failure to actually have a BA agreement in place. And that may sound unusual, but consider a covered entity can have close to an average facility can have close to 400 to 500 business associates. It's not uncommon that depending upon the processes that you have in place, that you may not even have implemented that agreement. So that was one of the reasons. And then the second was that there really was a lack of organizational oversight and security risk analysis as it relates to their own organization and to that of their business associates. And there's been several of these fines in the last couple of years. The University of Washington Medical Center up in Seattle, again, as well, had a pretty significant fine related towards the same issue, lack of good business associate oversight. So I want to talk a little bit about how have things changed in the last few years. So as you know, organizations that have are sharing PHI data with their vendors. In the past, you were required to sign a business associate agreement with them, and that by having that agreement in place, it specified that that vendor would follow the terms and requirements as it related to complying with HIPAA. In the past, 3 years ago, as a covered entity, having that in place, the responsibility and liability related to the protection of that data and anything associated with any breach of that information fell upon that business associate. Well, that environment has changed. The HIPAA law changed, and it now states that beyond having the agreement in place, it's your responsibility as a covered entity to make sure that you have oversight and proof that that vendor or that business associate is actually complying with the requirements of that agreement. And if you don't, you are just as liable as they are for any breach of that information. The fines are increasing significantly. There's changes to the breach notification requirements, and it is required that regular security risk analysis are performed. I just came back from the 2016 HCCA conference, and really the top 2 areas of focus of that conference were around oversight of vendors and business associates and having the proper tools in place to make sure that they're complying, and obviously having the right risk analysis tools in place to prevent the ever-increasing cyber attacks that are coming on. And both the OIG and the OCR are stepping up their enforcement and have indicated that if indeed they come out and find that these tools are not in place, they will basically camp out there until they all are done. So it's better to be proactive and begin to put these types of tools in place. So what's the nightmare, as you know, we spoke about related towards the oversight of vendors? Do you even have an understanding of the compliance and risk status of those? Very difficult to do. And as I mentioned, as a covered entity, today, you're liable for the acts and omissions of your business associates. If you do not have a documented and provable system in place to show that you have oversight, you're in very great risk of being liable or being audited for that. So how could that organization avoided this fine? One is to really implement and institute an organization-wide risk analysis. Obviously, you need to identify your BAs and your vendors. Again, that at times can be quite a bigger task than it may seem. But you need to identify them. You need to have proof that you both have documentation of an agreement that's in place. And really, you need to be doing proactive assessment and audit of those vendors and continuously monitoring them. If you do not, again, you're putting the organization or your organization at risk. And last year alone, close to 40% of all the breaches that took place were due to business associates. So how are most entities doing this today? They're utilizing complex Excel spreadsheets as a means to just be able to document the agreements they have in place and know when they have to renew them. They may be doing manual surveys. You may have put together your own kind of compliance checklist that you're having those organizations fill out for you to try to document this. There may be spot checks, static spot checks that are done. And of course, this is very expensive, time-consuming, and oftentimes not complete because of the sheer magnitude of the number of those that require oversight. It is very apparent that there are only a handful that may be done, and of course, if there's only a handful, then again, you're putting the organization at great risk. And there is no continuous monitoring really today. As you mentioned, this is a brief overview of some of the changes and also lessons learned from recent fines that have been brought down. But in closing, the enforcement of the HIPAA requirements are ramping up significantly. There is more and more money that's being poured into OIG and OCR to conduct this enforcement, and they definitely mean business as it relates to making sure that you have those in place. Certainly you need to do, as it relates to your vendors and BAs, a system-wide inventory of all vendors handling your PHI data, and really then establishing a process to make sure that the agreements are in place, countersigned, and just as importantly, instituting a continuous security risk analysis process for all of your vendors. Having these in place and having the structured audit trail of all the communications that you have with them will put your organization in a much better position and significantly reduce your risk exposure as it relates to those vendors in your own organization. And lastly, as we spoke about, there are not a lot of tools out there, but you should really be looking to find and identify infrastructure tools that can aid you in this process. Again, if we're talking about hundreds, if not thousands of vendors, if you don't have tools to help you with that, it is virtually impossible to be able to provide that regular and continual oversight of these types of processes. So it's highly recommended that you evaluate tools that can help you with that, and one, not only housing, but two, being able to do regular monitoring of your vendors. And with that, that concludes the educational overview of this session. If you're interested in learning more, if you'd like copies of the slides, we will send those out to you. And of course, if you want more information, you can always go to our website or info@ageify.com to get more content on this, as well as tools that we have that might assist you in this process. So briefly, we're going to go ahead and take some questions. If you'll note in the question section on the right-hand side of your screen, there's an answer, or there's an area where you can go ahead and type in your questions, and we'll go ahead and field those now. So one of the questions was that particular organization finds, particularly in relating back to the North Memorial case, simply because they didn't have a BA in place, or was there more to that? Really, it was quite simple. Of course, what had taken place, again, was more complex in that there was a significant number of records that became exposed and obviously breached. And as that investigation was done into why, of course, an organization, if they do have a breach, has to notify their respective agencies about that. And then generally with those, then there is an audit or an investigation that is done. And believe it or not, they identified that that organization did not even have a business associate agreement in place, yet they were sharing protected health information with them. And lastly, as a component of that, they obviously did not have any kind of regular risk analysis program in place for them. So what they identified was, while they may have had BA agreements in place for other vendors, they really didn't have any kind of monitoring oversight program, and obviously this became a very significant issue for them. Another question. You mentioned increase in OCR audits and them ramping up. Yes, I just came back, as I mentioned, from the 2016 HCCA conference, and they actually had leadership from both the OIG and the OCR there presenting. And in their presentations, they had both said that, we're a bit beyond now the digital or digitization of the health record. And because of that, there's a lot of potential exposure, opportunity for exposure of this data. They are taking the enforcement of the rule very seriously, because I think what they've identified as they've looked into these, that a lot of the reasons that they had issues was because there was lack of proper oversight and not having structured security risk management processes and compliance processes in place. And as such, if indeed you are called for an audit, or there is something and they do come out and find that those are not in place, they literally said that they will camp out at your facility until all those things are put in place. And of course, the average cost to an organization, just alone from a fine perspective, is to the tune of close to $2 million. Last question. You mentioned that you have tools in place to help with this. Yes, there's a number of organizations that may approach this. There's contract management tools that can help you in terms of housing the BA as a component of that contract. We at Agify have some other tools that really help with the overall monitoring. It's not just housing of documents, but really the monitoring process that allow you to have very structured and simple ways to oversee the compliance of all your vendors. And as I mentioned, if you're interested in that, please go ahead and reach out to us, and we'd be more than happy to schedule time to present that to you as well. Great. Any other questions? Well, it looked like we were able to actually even conduct this session in a shorter period of time. Really appreciate all the folks that have joined this session. Again, it's a very important area, and really the top kind of two priorities with CIOs and healthcare executives now are the protection of the very valuable data that they house. And more investment is being made from a compliance and from a safety perspective on making sure that that takes place. Great. So thank you all for your time. And again, please reach out to us if you would like more information. All the best.